The small town of Corning, New York, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Tree-lined streets, neighbors who knew each other's names, and the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked at night. For Michele Neurauter, this quiet upstate haven represented everything she wanted for her 3 daughters after years of a troubled marriage. But on a late August afternoon in 2017, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. What appeared to be a tragic suicide would soon unravel into something far more sinister. A story involving manipulation, betrayal, and an unthinkable choice that would destroy a family from within. This is the story of how a father's obsession with control led to murder, and how he convinced his own daughter to help him commit the ultimate betrayal. Michele Neurauter had always been the kind of mother who put her children first. After her divorce from Lloyd in 2013, she'd worked hard to create a stable home for her 3 girls. The oldest had already moved out. 19-year-old Carrie was away at college in Rochester, and the youngest, just 14, was still at home navigating the complexities of high school. Those who knew Michele described her as brilliant and determined. She held a master's degree and taught English at a local college, always encouraging her daughters to be well-spoken and educated. After years of what friends described as an controlling marriage, Michele seemed to be finding her footing as a single mother. The divorce hadn't been easy. Lloyd, an engineer at the local Corning Glass Works, had fought tooth and nail for custody of the children. What followed was a relentless legal battle that consumed years of Michele's life and drained her emotionally and financially. Court records would later reveal an astounding 26 separate legal filings after their divorce was finalized. 26. In most cases, divorce attorneys see maybe 2 or 3 post-divorce filings at most. But Lloyd was different. He seemed determined to use the legal system as a weapon, filing motion after motion, making false claims, and trying to get out of child support payments. Michele's friends and family watched as this legal harassment took its toll. Every time she thought she could move forward, another court date would appear, another filing, another attempt by Lloyd to drag her back into the system that had already caused her so much pain. But then, in late August 2017, something unexpected happened. Lloyd failed to show up for a crucial court hearing regarding his petition for sole custody of their youngest daughter. For a man who had been obsessively litigious for years, this was completely out of character. He didn't withdraw his petition, didn't ask for a postponement, didn't even answer the court's calls or emails. Michele's attorney was shocked. This was the same man who had filed motion after motion for years, and now he simply didn't show up. It was unthinkable, especially given his pattern of behavior. When the case was dismissed due to his no-show, Michele felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since their bitter divorce, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Lloyd was finally ready to move on. That weekend, Michele seemed happier than she had been in months. Friends would later remember seeing her and her youngest daughter sliding down grassy hills on blocks of ice, laughing and enjoying the simple pleasure of a summer day together. It was the kind of carefree moment that had been rare during the years of legal battles, but that joy would be short-lived. On Monday, August 28th, a family friend arrived at Michele's house to pick up her 14-year-old daughter for swim practice. When no one answered the door, concern quickly turned to alarm. Through the glass panels of the front door, the friend could see something was terribly wrong. Sergeant John McDivitt was the first police officer to respond to the scene that afternoon. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Michele Neurauter was lying at the bottom of her staircase, a rope around her neck. She was cold and stiff to the touch, clearly having been dead for hours. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide by hanging. But as McDivitt and other investigators examined the scene more closely, things didn't add up. There was an unusual ligature mark on Michelle's chin that didn't match the pattern they would expect to see in a typical hanging. It looked as though someone had gone behind her, thrown a rope over her neck, and pulled back and down. Even more concerning was the fact that Michelle's youngest daughter, the one who was supposed to be picked up for swim practice, was nowhere to be found. In a case that already seemed suspicious, a missing child raised the stakes dramatically. Police Chief Jeff Spaulding arrived on scene and immediately shared McDivitt's concerns. The physical evidence didn't match what they would expect to see in a suicide. The positioning of the body, the ligature marks, the rope itself. All of it seemed wrong somehow. As officers searched the house from top to bottom, checking basements, attics, and garages, the hours ticked by with no sign of the missing teenager. The possible outcomes were all terrifying to contemplate. Then, late that evening, the phone rang at the police station. It was Carrie, Michelle's 19-year-old daughter, calling from Rochester, nearly 100 miles away. She had devastating news to share, but also brought relief to the frantic search efforts. The 14-year-old was safe. She was with Carrie in Rochester, nearly 100 miles from the crime scene. But Carrie's explanation of how they ended up there would be the first of many stories that didn't quite make sense. She claimed that she had driven back to Corning late Saturday night to spend one last night in her childhood bedroom before the school semester began. According to Carrie, Michelle had become enraged at her, accusing her of taking Lloyd's side in their ongoing custody battle. Carrie told police that Michelle had been screaming and carrying on, and that she became concerned for her younger sister's safety. So, she claimed, she had taken the 14-year-old outside, put her in the car, and driven back to Rochester in the middle of the night. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but it raised immediate questions for investigators. Why would Michelle be so upset on the same day she had been celebrating a major legal victory? Friends and family who knew Michelle described her as determined and resilient, not someone who would take her own life just as things were finally looking up. Her mother, Jeanne, was adamant from the moment she heard the news. Michelle would never have committed suicide. She had fought too hard for too long to give up now. She had 3 daughters who needed her, a career she loved, and finally seemed to be emerging from the shadow of her toxic marriage. But if Michelle had been murdered, who could have done it? And how? Lloyd had what appeared to be an airtight alibi. According to both him and Carrie, he had been in California for a job interview when Michelle's body was discovered. He had flown out there on Sunday morning, more than 24 hours before police found Michelle on Monday afternoon. The timeline seemed to check out, but investigators weren't ready to rule anyone out just yet. They began digging deeper into the movements of everyone involved in the days leading up to Michelle's death. What they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about family loyalty, manipulation, and just how far a parent might go to control their children's lives. The investigation was just beginning, but already, nothing was as it seemed. When Lloyd finally returned from California and learned of Michelle's death, his first stop wasn't to comfort his grieving daughters or make funeral arrangements. Instead, he went straight to the family court building to stop his child support and maintenance payments. For investigators, this cold calculation was their first real glimpse into Lloyd's true character. But Lloyd seemed prepared for their questions. When police caught up with him outside the courthouse, he appeared calm and composed, ready with answers that matched Carrie's story perfectly. He explained how he had helped Carrie move into her college apartment on Saturday, stayed at a nearby hotel that night, and flew out to California early Sunday morning for his job interview. The hotel security cameras seemed to back up his story. There was Lloyd, checking into the microtel on Saturday evening. There was Carrie, arriving for breakfast with her younger sister the next morning at 7 a.m. The timestamps appeared to give Lloyd an ironclad alibi, but as investigators dug deeper into the surveillance footage, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like a perfect story. The cameras showed Lloyd walking Carrie to her car that Saturday night. But then something interesting happened. Instead of returning to the hotel alone, the video showed Lloyd getting into the car with Carrie and driving off into the night. More importantly, the cameras never showed him returning to the hotel that evening, while Lloyd's cell phone had remained in his hotel room all night, pinging the local towers consistently. Lloyd himself appeared to have been somewhere else entirely. The next morning, at 6:30 a.m., the cameras captured him walking across the parking lot toward his vehicle, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. For investigators, this was the first concrete evidence that Lloyd had been lying to them. But lying about where you spent the night doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. They needed more. The motive became clearer as they examined Lloyd's financial situation. Despite his engineering job at Corning, he was drowning in debt. Over $100,000 in credit card bills, and monthly payments to Michele of nearly $6,000 in child support and alimony. The financial pressure was mounting, and Michele's death would solve multiple problems at once. Not only would the support payments stop, but Lloyd stood to collect on Michele's life insurance policy, worth $260,000. For a man facing financial ruin, his ex-wife's death represented a potential windfall 2.5 months after Michele's death, with the case still officially undetermined. Investigators decided to employ a technique known in law enforcement circles as tickling the wire. They would place wiretaps on both Lloyd and Carrie's phones, then create a situation that might prompt them to have revealing conversations. The ruse was simple. An investigator called Carrie, claiming they had additional questions and wanted to meet with her again. It was a common technique, designed to create anxiety and hopefully prompt incriminating phone calls. The strategy worked better than they could have hoped. Within minutes of hanging up with police, Carrie was on the phone with her father, clearly panicked about the request for another meeting. Lloyd's response was telling. Instead of encouraging his daughter to cooperate with the investigation, he immediately began coaching her on what to say. More suspiciously, when Carrie suggested she could easily meet with the investigator and tell the same story she had already given, Lloyd shut down the idea entirely. He instructed her to claim he had a counseling appointment back in New Jersey and couldn't make himself available. For investigators listening in, Lloyd's behavior raised an obvious question. If they were both telling the truth about Michele's death, why would Lloyd be so reluctant to speak with police again? Why coach Carrie on how to avoid the meeting? Innocent people typically want to help solve cases, not avoid investigators. But the wiretaps alone weren't enough to build a murder case. The district attorney needed more concrete evidence, so he took an unusual step. He asked a private forensic pathologist to take a fresh look at all the evidence from Michele's autopsy. By this time, Lloyd had already had Michele's body cremated, so there was no physical remains for the pathologist to examine. But using the original autopsy photos, documentation, and evidence from the scene, the expert reached a conclusion that changed everything. Michele Neurauter had been murdered. The ligature mark on her chin, the specific pattern of hemorrhaging in her eyes, and other forensic details all pointed to one conclusion. Michele had been strangled to death, and her body had been positioned to make it look like suicide. Armed with this new determination, investigators were ready to move. On January 24th, 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's death, they coordinated simultaneous confrontations with both Lloyd and Carrie. Two investigators showed up at Lloyd's office in New Jersey, while a pair of state police troopers found Carrie at her college internship in Syracuse. This was their Hail Mary pass, their chance to finally get the truth about what happened that night. The strategy of separating them proved crucial. When investigators told Lloyd that the medical examiner had ruled Michelle's death a homicide, he maintained his innocence. He even agreed to take a polygraph test, seeming confident in his ability to pass. But 200 miles away in Syracuse, Carrie was having a very different reaction to the news. Away from her father's influence for the first time since the murder, the psychological pressure finally became too much to bear. In barely a whisper, 19-year-old Carrie began to tell investigators what really happened on the night her mother died. Her father had come to Michelle's house with her that night, and she had helped him get inside undetected. According to Carrie's confession, Lloyd had approached her with an unthinkable proposition just 1 week before the murder. He claimed he was facing financial ruin and couldn't afford to keep paying Michelle. He presented his daughter with what he framed as an impossible choice. He could kill himself, leaving Carrie and her sisters orphaned and without financial support. Or there was what he called Plan B. He would kill Michelle instead, making it look like suicide, and the family's problems would be solved. For a 19-year-old who had been subjected to years of her father's manipulation and control, the choice seemed real. In her mind, she wasn't choosing between her parents' lives. She was choosing between losing one parent or losing both. The confession revealed the horrific details of that night. Carrie had driven back to Corning, not to spend a night in her childhood bedroom as she had originally claimed, but to help her father commit murder. She had brought him into the house through the front door, while her younger sister slept in the living room. Lloyd went upstairs to confront Michelle in her bedroom. At first, there was arguing. Michelle was confused and frightened, demanding to know why her ex-husband was in her home in the middle of the night. Then, according to Carrie, it suddenly got very quiet. When Carrie saw her father again, her mother was dead. But the confession revealed something even more disturbing. Carrie hadn't just helped Lloyd get into the house. She had helped him stage the suicide scene, moving Michelle's body and positioning the rope to make it look like she had taken her own life. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment had been years in the making. What experts would later identify as parental alienation had systematically turned Carrie against her mother, making Michelle seem like the enemy rather than the victim. As investigators prepared to arrest Lloyd, they discovered he had vanished. The confident man who had agreed to take a polygraph test had disappeared rather than face the consequences of his actions. They tracked his cell phone to downtown Princeton, New Jersey, where they found him on the roof of a municipal parking garage. When officers moved in to arrest him, Lloyd bolted to the edge of the 5-story structure and threatened to jump. For 2 hours, he kept police at bay, teetering on the edge of the building as negotiators tried to talk him down. In the end, it took a tackle from a New Jersey state trooper to bring him safely into custody. The man who had orchestrated his ex-wife's murder and manipulated his own daughter into helping him was finally under arrest. But the most difficult questions were still ahead. How had a father convinced his child to help him kill her mother? And what price should Carrie pay for her role in such an unthinkable crime? The confession that Carrie gave to investigators that day would haunt everyone who heard it. Here was a 19-year-old college student describing in clinical detail how she had helped her father murder her mother. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment was staggering in its scope and devastation. District Attorney Brooks Baker knew he was dealing with something unprecedented. In 30 years of prosecuting cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The level of control that Lloyd had exercised over his daughter, the systematic way he had turned her against her mother, represented what experts call parental alienation taken to its most extreme conclusion. Carrie's cooperation with the investigation became crucial to building the case against Lloyd. But her confession also revealed the depth of her own involvement. She hadn't just opened a door for her father. She had actively participated in staging Michelle's death to look like suicide, moving her mother's body and helping position the rope. The forensic evidence began to make sense once investigators understood what had really happened. Lloyd's DNA was found on Michelle's clothing, the pajamas she was wearing the night she was murdered. The unusual ligature mark on her chin now had an explanation. The positioning of her body at the bottom of the stairs suddenly fit the narrative of a staged crime scene. When Lloyd was finally captured after his dramatic standoff on the parking garage, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. He could admit his guilt and face 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Or he could go to trial and risk life without parole if convicted. Lloyd chose to plead guilty, but even in his confession, he couldn't resist blaming Michelle one final time. He told the judge he killed his ex-wife because he believed she might hurt their children. It was a final act of manipulation, an attempt to portray himself as a protective father rather than a calculating murderer. The judge saw through it immediately. Lloyd Neurauter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 45, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again able to manipulate or control anyone. But what about Carrie? The young woman who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she helped kill her own mother. Her case presented an almost impossible moral and legal question. How do you punish someone who was both perpetrator and victim? Michelle's mother, Jeanne, struggled with this question more than anyone. She had lost her daughter, but she also understood that Carrie had been psychologically destroyed by years of manipulation. In a letter to the court, she wrote that she didn't believe Michelle would want her daughter to spend decades in prison. The judge agreed. Carrie was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter rather than murder. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison, a remarkably lenient sentence that reflected the court's recognition of the extraordinary circumstances. Carrie was released on parole on January 16, 2020, after serving just over a year behind bars. She disappeared from public view, presumably trying to rebuild a life shattered by her father's manipulation and her own terrible choices. The case left everyone involved grappling with profound questions about family, manipulation, and justice. How does a parent convince their child to commit such an unthinkable act? How do you assign blame when the lines between victim and perpetrator become so blurred? Michele Neurauter's death represents more than just another domestic violence case. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating power of psychological manipulation and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain control over others. Today, Lloyd remains in prison. His dreams of financial freedom and continued control over his family's lives reduced to the confines of a cell. His daughters must live with the knowledge that their father murdered their mother and convinced one of them to help. In the end, Michelle's fight for her children's well-being continued even after her death, as the truth of what happened that night finally came to light. The woman who had spent years trying to protect her daughters from their father's manipulation had become his final victim. But her story would serve as a warning about the deadly consequences of unchecked control and abuse. The small town of Corning, New York, where neighbors once felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, learned that the greatest dangers sometimes come from within our own families. And somewhere, a young woman tries to live with the choices she made on one terrible night, when a father's manipulation led to a mother's death and a family's destruction. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand your ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed. But the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry: Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. May 5th, 2009. A date that would forever change a quiet suburban community and shatter the illusion of safety that so many families take for granted. What started as a routine morning would quickly transform into one of the most shocking and disturbing crime scenes that seasoned investigators had ever encountered. Picture this. You're living in what appears to be the perfect American neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards. The kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked. Where the biggest worry might be whether the kids remembered their homework or if dinner would be ready on time. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. Sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very person you should fear. And sometimes, the warning signs are literally written on the wall. This is the story of a family that seemed to have everything: a devoted mother, 2 young boys with bright futures ahead of them, and a father who worked in security, protecting others for a living. It's also the story of how quickly that perfect life can crumble when secrets, lies, and obsessions collide in the most devastating way possible. The morning began like countless others in Columbia, Illinois, a small community just outside St. Louis, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode their bikes safely through quiet subdivisions. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossible, where families moved to escape the dangers of city life. Christopher Coleman had left his house that morning around 5:40, heading to the gym as part of his regular routine. His wife Sherry and their two sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. By 7 in the morning, Chris was trying to reach his family by phone. When nobody answered, concern began to creep in. After all, Sherry should have been awake by then, getting the boys ready for school, going through the familiar morning rituals that define family life. What happened next would expose a web of deception so twisted and cruel that it would challenge everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Detective Justin Barlow lived just across the street from the Coleman family. For 5 years, he had been their neighbor, watching their children grow, exchanging pleasantries over backyard fences. When Chris called that morning, asking someone to check on his family, Barlow had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. The house looked normal from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The kind of suburban home you'd see in any middle-class neighborhood across America. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Barlow approached the front door first, peering through windows, looking for any sign of the family inside. When that revealed nothing, he made his way around to the basement area. That's when he noticed something that would prove to be crucial to understanding how this horror unfolded. A basement window was open, not just unlocked, but actually open, in a house where the family had been receiving death threats, where security should have been paramount. This detail would later raise serious questions about what really happened that night. The detective entered through the basement, making his way up the stairs toward the main floor of the house. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. The sharp, acrid scent of spray paint hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of dread before he even understood why. As he reached the main floor and turned toward the kitchen area, Barlow encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Scrawled across the walls in red spray paint were messages that seemed torn from the darkest corners of human imagination. Words like "punished" stared back at him, written in what appeared to be the hand of someone consumed by rage and hatred. These weren't random acts of vandalism. These messages had a purpose, a meaning that would become clear as the investigation unfolded. They were meant to tell a story, to point investigators in a specific direction, to create a narrative that would explain the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this suburban home. But Detective Barlow's discovery was far from over. Following the trail of disturbing messages, he made his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the family should have been sleeping safely. What he found there would shake this small community to its core and launch one of the most intensive investigations in the region's history. The scene upstairs was one of calculated brutality, masked by an attempt to stage something else entirely. 3 lives had been taken during the night, each victim found in their own bedroom, each having met their end in the place where they should have felt most secure. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, was discovered in the master bedroom. Her 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their respective rooms, their lives cut short before they had barely begun to live them. The method used to end their lives was particularly disturbing, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the victims and a level of planning that went far beyond a random act of violence. But perhaps most chilling of all were the additional messages left throughout the house. More spray-painted words that seemed designed to tell a specific story, about who might have committed these acts and why. Messages that would initially lead investigators down one path, only to have the evidence eventually point in a completely different direction. The phrase, "You have paid," was found leading up the staircase, as if marking a trail toward the bedrooms where the victims lay. It was a message that suggested retribution, that these deaths were somehow justified in the mind of whoever wrote those words. As word spread through the neighborhood that morning, the peaceful suburban community of Columbia was transformed into something resembling a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators descended on what had been a quiet residential street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, many still in their pajamas, trying to understand what could have happened to the family they all knew and respected. The Coleman family had seemed to embody everything that made this community special. Chris worked in security for a prominent religious organization, providing protection for high-profile events and traveling around the world in service of his faith. Sherry was a devoted mother who had put her own career aside to focus on raising their two boys. Garrett and Gavin were the kind of children that made adults smile when they saw them playing in the front yard. Polite, well-mannered, always ready to help a neighbor or lend a hand with yard work, they were active in local sports, did well in school, and seemed to have unlimited potential ahead of them. This was not the kind of family that anyone would expect to become victims of such brutal violence. They were pillars of their community, respected by neighbors, and seemingly living the American dream in a place where dreams were supposed to come true safely. But as investigators would soon discover, beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait lay secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Colemans. Secrets about relationships, about deception, and about a plan so methodical and cruel that it would challenge everything people believed about human nature. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on new significance. Were these murders the result of Chris's work in security? Had someone targeted his family as a way to get to the prominent religious figure he protected? Or was there something else entirely at play here? As investigators began piecing together the timeline of that horrific morning, questions started mounting faster than answers. The major case squad was called in immediately, bringing together 25 of the most experienced detectives from across the region. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something that would test every skill they had developed over years of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior. The house itself became a puzzle that investigators would spend weeks trying to solve. Every room told part of a story, but the pieces didn't quite fit together the way they should have. The basement window that had been left open raised immediate red flags. Here was a family that had been living under the shadow of death threats for months, yet their home had been left vulnerable to exactly the kind of intrusion they should have been guarding against. Christopher Coleman was brought to the police station that morning, not as a suspect, but as a grieving husband and father who needed to help investigators understand what might have happened to his family. The image he presented was one of absolute devastation. A man whose world had just collapsed around him, who couldn't comprehend how such evil could have touched his loved ones. But experienced detectives know that grief can manifest in many different ways. Some people become hysterical, others withdraw completely. Some ask endless questions about what happened and how their loved ones died. Chris Coleman's reaction fell into none of these typical categories, and that began to concern the investigators who were trying to help him. During those first crucial hours of questioning, Coleman seemed oddly detached from the horror that had befallen his family. He never asked about the specific details of how his wife and children had died. He didn't demand to know what evidence had been found or what leads investigators were pursuing. For a man whose family had just been brutally murdered, his lack of curiosity struck the detectives as unusual. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Columbia, Illinois. If these murders were connected to Coleman's work in security, then the suspect pool could include anyone from around the world who might have harbored resentment against the religious organization he protected. Investigators began tracking down individuals who had sent threatening emails or made hostile comments about the ministry's work. It was painstaking detective work that involved following leads across multiple states and even international boundaries. Every person who had ever expressed anger or frustration had to be located and their whereabouts verified for the night of the murders. It was the kind of investigation that could take months or even years to complete thoroughly. But while that global search was underway, investigators were also looking more closely at the evidence found within the Coleman home itself. The spray-painted messages that had initially seemed to point toward an outsider with a grudge began revealing details that didn't quite match the narrative they appeared to tell. The handwriting analysis became a crucial component of the investigation. Experts were brought in to examine every letter, every stroke of the spray paint that had been used to create those menacing messages. What they discovered would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Meanwhile, the community of Columbia was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their peaceful neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors started locking doors that had remained open for years. The sense of security that had drawn so many families to this area was shattered in a single morning. Local churches organized prayer vigils and support groups for families who were having trouble explaining to their children how something so terrible could happen to people they knew. The psychological impact rippled through the entire community, affecting not just those who knew the Colemans personally, but anyone who had ever felt safe in their own home. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering aspects of Christopher Coleman's life that painted a very different picture than the one his neighbors and community members had known. Phone records, computer files, and financial documents started revealing a complex web of relationships and motivations that had nothing to do with religious extremists or international threats. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on a different significance as investigators dug deeper into their origins. Computer forensics experts were brought in to trace the digital footprints of these threatening messages, and what they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Every email, every letter, every threatening communication was subjected to the most advanced analysis available. The technology existed to trace these messages back to their source, to determine not just where they had come from, but what devices had been used to create them. The results of this analysis would prove to be absolutely devastating to the narrative that had initially seemed so obvious. As weeks turned into months, the investigation revealed layer after layer of deception that went far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a case of a family being targeted by strangers. This was something far more personal, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in Columbia could have anticipated. The perfect family that neighbors had admired was revealed to be struggling with issues that nobody outside their home had ever suspected. Financial pressures, relationship problems, and personal conflicts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The kind of problems that millions of families face, but that in this case had escalated to unthinkable consequences. Detective work of this magnitude requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to understand human psychology and motivation. Investigators had to piece together not just what had happened on that terrible night, but why someone would be driven to commit such acts against people who should have been able to trust them completely. The evidence was mounting, but it was pointing in a direction that nobody had wanted to consider. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you see every day, someone you trust implicitly, someone who knows your routines and your vulnerabilities better than any stranger ever could. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Tara Lynch, a woman from Florida who had claimed to be merely a friend, was actually much more than that. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between her and Christopher Coleman. Credit card statements showed trips they had taken together. Hotel reservations painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months, hidden from everyone in Colombia. What made this discovery even more shocking was the connection between Tara and the Coleman family. She wasn't just some random woman that Chris had met through work. She was actually one of Sherry's old friends from high school. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding before investigators' eyes. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The affair had begun in the fall of 2008, just months before the death threats started arriving at the Coleman home. The connection between these two events was too significant to ignore. Computer forensics revealed something that would prove absolutely crucial to the case. Those threatening emails that had initially pointed investigators toward international suspects had actually originated from Christopher Coleman's own laptop. The account that had been used to send them was created using information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Coleman family would have known. The spray paint used to write those menacing messages on the walls had been purchased at a local hardware store, and the receipt bore Christopher Coleman's signature. The same man who had reported receiving death threats had actually been the one creating them all along. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tara Lynch had been keeping detailed records of her relationship with Coleman, including photos and videos that contradicted everything he had told investigators about the timeline of their affair. Among these photos was one that would ultimately seal Coleman's fate. A picture of the couple kissing, with a timestamp showing it had been taken weeks before Coleman claimed their relationship had even begun. When confronted with this evidence, his carefully constructed story began falling apart completely. The motive became crystal clear once investigators understood the full scope of Coleman's deception. He had been living a double life for months, promising Tara that he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They had even discussed wedding dates and future plans together, but there was a problem. Coleman's job with the religious ministry came with strict moral guidelines. Adultery could cost him his position and his substantial salary. He needed Sherry to be the one to file for divorce, to make it appear that the marriage had failed through no fault of his own. When Sherry discovered the affair but refused to divorce him, Coleman found himself trapped. He couldn't marry Tara without losing his job, but he couldn't continue the deception indefinitely either. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he began planning what he believed would be the perfect solution. The death threats served multiple purposes in his scheme. They established a pattern of outside danger that would provide an obvious suspect when the murders occurred. They also gave him an excuse to install security cameras in his home, which he could later claim had malfunctioned or been tampered with. On the night of May 4th, Coleman put his plan into action. While his family slept, he methodically ended their lives, then spent time creating the crime scene that would support his story. The spray-painted messages, the open window, the missing security footage. Every detail had been calculated to point investigators away from him. The autopsy results revealed the true horror of what had happened that night. Sherry had fought for her life, sustaining injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her 2 young sons had been killed in their beds, never having a chance to defend themselves or escape. Physical evidence on Coleman's body told the story of that final confrontation with his wife. Scratches on his arms matched the defensive wounds found on Sherry's hands. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, despite his attempts to clean up afterward. When Christopher Coleman was finally arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's shock was palpable. This was a man they had trusted, respected, and admired. The revelation that he had been capable of such calculated evil shattered their faith in their own judgment about human nature. The trial that followed would captivate the nation and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for deception that exists within seemingly ordinary people. The evidence presented painted a picture of a man so consumed by selfishness and obsession that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone who stood in the way of his desires. In the end, justice was served. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the community of Columbia, for Sherry's family and friends, and for everyone who had known and loved Garrett and Gavin, no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left behind. The writing had indeed been on the wall, but not in the way anyone had initially understood. The real message wasn't in those spray-painted threats or staged crime scene elements. It was in the pattern of lies, the web of deception, and the cold calculation that had led a father and husband to become the very monster his family should have been protected from. This case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly among us, wearing familiar faces and maintaining respectable facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The most dangerous predators are often those who know us best, who understand our vulnerabilities, and who have earned our trust through years of careful deception. The community of Columbia eventually began to heal, but they never forgot the lessons learned from this tragedy. They created memorials to honor Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, ensuring that their memory would live on long after the horror of their deaths had faded. And they remained vigilant, understanding now that safety isn't guaranteed simply by living in the right neighborhood or surrounding yourself with the right people. The writing on the wall had told a story, but it wasn't the story anyone expected. In the heart of South Carolina's Low Country, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees and generations of families have built their legacies, one name has commanded respect and wielded power for over a century. That name is Murdaugh. But what happens when a dynasty built on law and order becomes the center of a criminal investigation that reads like something straight out of a crime thriller? Welcome to the Murdaugh Mysteries, where privilege meets peril, and where the very family that once upheld justice now finds itself at the center of multiple deaths, financial scandals, and a web of secrets that continues to unravel with each passing day. For more than 100 years, the Murdaugh family controlled the legal landscape of this quiet corner of South Carolina. 3 generations served as solicitors, essentially the chief prosecutors for the region. They didn't just practice law, they were the law. Their influence stretched far beyond the courtroom, touching every aspect of life in Hampton County and beyond. But empires, no matter how powerful, can crumble, and when they do, the fall is often spectacular. Our story begins not with the family's rise to power, but with its dramatic descent into chaos. It starts on a February night in 2019 when 6 young friends decided to spend an evening partying on the water. What should have been a fun night out would instead become the first domino to fall in a series of events that would expose decades of alleged corruption, cover-ups, and tragedy. The evening started innocently enough. Paul Murdaugh, the 19-year-old son of prominent attorney Alex Murdaugh, gathered 5 friends for what was meant to be a typical night of teenage rebellion. They met at the family's river house on a private island, a testament to the wealth and privilege that surrounded the Murdaugh name. But this wasn't just any teenager hosting a party. Paul carried the weight of a family legacy that had shaped this region for generations. His great-grandfather, grandfather, and father had all been lawyers. The family name opened doors, commanded respect, and as we would later learn, provided a sense of untouchability that would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. The group included Connor Cook, his cousin Anthony Cook, Anthony's girlfriend Mallory Beach, and 2 other friends. All were underage, and all had been drinking. Paul had used his older brother Buster's identification to purchase beer earlier that evening, a detail that would later become significant as investigators pieced together the events of that tragic night. Around 8 in the evening, they boarded the family's boat and headed to a party at a house along the river. The night progressed as many do for young people with too much freedom and too little supervision. They drank, they laughed, they enjoyed the privilege of youth and wealth. But as the hours ticked by, alcohol consumption increased and tensions began to rise. Just after midnight, the group decided to head toward downtown Beaufort. Paul and Connor wanted to visit a local bar. Despite being underage, video footage from that evening would later show some members of the group appearing heavily intoxicated, their judgment clearly impaired by alcohol and the reckless confidence of youth. By 1:15 in the morning, they were back on the water, heading home. But what should have been a simple boat ride became something far more dangerous. According to witness statements, Paul was driving erratically, performing donuts in the water, his behavior becoming increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. The other passengers grew frightened. They begged Paul to slow down, to let someone else drive, to simply let them off the boat. But Paul refused, in depositions given later. Witnesses described a young man drunk on both alcohol and power, convinced of his own invincibility. Mallory Beach, just 19 years old, was terrified. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams of the future, people who loved her. But on that February night, her fate became tied to the reckless decisions of someone who believed he was above consequences. The boat's navigation system would later provide investigators with a detailed timeline of those final moments. At 2:20 in the morning, the device recorded the boat slowing down and then suddenly speeding up again. Seconds later, it came to an abrupt stop when it struck a bridge piling at Archer's Creek. The impact was devastating. 5 of the 6 passengers survived, though several were seriously injured. But Mallory Beach was nowhere to be found. She had been thrown from the boat into the dark, cold water, and despite immediate search efforts, she had vanished. For 8 agonizing days, search teams scoured the waterways. Volunteers came from neighboring states to help look for the missing teenager. Her family held on to hope, praying for a miracle that would never come. Finally, 2 volunteer searchers found Mallory's body about 5 miles downstream from the crash site. The discovery devastated not just her family, but the entire community. Hundreds of people attended her funeral, a testament to the impact this young woman had made in her short life. Even members of the Murdaugh family attended, including Paul, the young man many believed was responsible for her death. But here's where the story takes a troubling turn, one that would set the stage for everything that followed. Despite clear evidence that Paul Murdaugh had been driving the boat while intoxicated, despite witness statements placing him at the wheel, despite his blood alcohol level being 3 times the legal limit hours after the crash, he was not immediately arrested. In fact, according to witnesses and court documents, Alex Murdaugh arrived at the hospital that night and seemed more concerned with damage control than with the tragedy that had just occurred. Hospital staff reported seeing him go from room to room, speaking with the other crash survivors, apparently trying to coordinate their stories. One security guard overheard a phone conversation where Alex allegedly said, "She's gone. Don't worry." These words would haunt Mallory's family, suggesting that instead of focusing on the search for the missing teenager, the family was already thinking about legal protection. Connor Cook later testified that while he was being treated for a broken jaw, Alex Murdaugh told him he didn't need to reveal who was driving the boat. The message was clear: protect Paul, regardless of the consequences. This wasn't just about a tragic accident anymore. This was about power, privilege, and the lengths to which a powerful family would go to protect one of their own. The Murdaugh name, which had commanded respect for over a century, was now being used as a shield against accountability. For nearly 2 months, as Mallory's family grieved and sought answers, Paul Murdaugh remained free. He wasn't arrested, wasn't charged, wasn't held accountable for the decision that had cost a young woman her life. The delay seemed to confirm what many in the community had long suspected, that the Murdaughs played by different rules than everyone else. The charges, when they finally came, arrived on what would have been Mallory's 20th birthday. Paul was charged with 3 felony counts, including boating under the influence causing death. But even then, the special treatment continued. He was never handcuffed during his arrest, never spent a single day in jail, and was released on a relatively modest bond. For Mallory's family, this wasn't justice. This was a continuation of a system that seemed designed to protect the powerful while ordinary people suffered the consequences. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, hoping that civil court might provide the accountability that the criminal justice system seemed reluctant to deliver. But the Murdaugh story was far from over. In fact, the boat crash was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, as Paul's case slowly made its way through the legal system, other troubling questions began to emerge about the family's past. There was the mysterious death of Stephen Smith, a 19-year-old found dead on a rural road in 2015 under circumstances that didn't quite add up to the hit-and-run ruling. There were whispers about the family's housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who had died after a fall at the Murdaugh estate, and questions about what happened to the insurance settlement from her death. Each revelation painted a picture of a family that had grown accustomed to operating outside the normal bounds of law and accountability. The very people who were supposed to uphold justice seemed to believe they were above it. But as we'll see, even the most powerful dynasties can't escape the consequences of their actions forever. The events set in motion by that tragic night in February 2019 would eventually bring down not just Paul Murdaugh, but the entire family empire. The stage was set for a reckoning that would shock South Carolina and capture the attention of the entire nation. What happened next would prove that, in the end, no one, not even the Murdaughs, is truly untouchable. The wheels of justice, as they say, grind slowly. But for the Murdaugh family, those wheels were about to pick up speed in ways no one could have anticipated. As Paul's case dragged through the legal system with no trial date in sight, life seemed to continue as normal for the young man who many believed had killed Mallory Beach. Paul was spotted at parties, driving boats, even getting speeding tickets while towing watercraft. To the outside world, it appeared that the Murdaugh name was once again providing protection from consequences. The family's influence seemed as strong as ever, their connections as deep as the roots of those ancient oak trees that lined their property. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The civil lawsuit filed by Mallory's family was moving forward, and it would require depositions from all the boat crash survivors. For the first time, people would be forced to testify under oath about what really happened that night. The truth, so carefully managed and controlled, was about to become much harder to contain. The depositions revealed disturbing details about Paul's behavior that night. Witnesses described a young man completely out of control, violent and aggressive, drunk on both alcohol and the belief that his family name made him untouchable. His girlfriend at the time testified that he had slapped and spit on her during the boat ride, leaving the wheel repeatedly to fight with her before returning to continue driving. Connor Cook's testimony was particularly damaging. He revealed that Alex Murdaugh had essentially coached him at the hospital, suggesting he didn't need to tell investigators who was driving the boat. This wasn't just about protecting Paul anymore. It was about a systematic effort to obstruct justice. The depositions painted a picture of a family willing to use every tool at their disposal to avoid accountability. But as the civil case progressed, other questions about the Murdaugh family's past began to surface with increasing frequency. There was Stephen Smith, the 19-year-old nursing student whose body had been found on a remote country road back in 2015. The official ruling was a hit and run, but investigators at the scene had their doubts. There was no vehicle debris, no evidence of impact, and Stephen's shoes were still on his feet despite supposedly being struck by a moving vehicle. Stephen was openly gay in a small, conservative town, and rumors had circulated for years about his death being connected to the Murdaugh family. No concrete evidence had ever emerged, but the whispers persisted. Stephen's mother had always believed her son was murdered, that his death was somehow connected to his sexuality and to powerful people who wanted it covered up. Then there was Gloria Satterfield, the family's longtime housekeeper who had worked for the Murdaughs for over 20 years. In 2018, she had died after what was described as a trip and fall accident on the front steps of the family's hunting lodge. The same property where, 3 years later, Maggie and Paul would meet their own violent end. Gloria's death had been ruled natural, with no autopsy performed. But at her funeral, Alex Murdaugh had done something unusual. He approached Gloria's sons and suggested they file a wrongful death lawsuit against him. He even recommended a lawyer, his former college roommate and Paul's godfather. It seemed like a generous gesture from a wealthy employer, taking responsibility for an employee's accident on his property. But the reality was far more sinister. The insurance company paid out over $4 million in the wrongful death settlement. None of that money ever reached Gloria's family. It had allegedly disappeared into Alex Murdaugh's own pockets. As 2021 began, these various threads were still separate investigations, different cases with different victims, but they all seemed to orbit around the same family, the same name that had controlled this corner of South Carolina for over a century. The Murdaughs had weathered scandals before, had survived challenges to their power, but this time felt different. The pressure was building from multiple directions. The civil lawsuit in Mallory's case was forcing uncomfortable truths into the open. Questions about Stephen Smith's death were being raised with renewed vigor. Financial irregularities were beginning to surface at the family law firm. For Alex Murdaugh, the walls were closing in. The man who had spent his career as a prosecutor, who understood better than most how the legal system worked, could see the danger approaching. His son Paul was facing serious criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. The family's reputation, built over generations, was crumbling. But if Alex thought things couldn't get worse, he was tragically mistaken. On the evening of June 7, 2021, everything changed in the most devastating way possible. It was a typical summer evening in the Low Country. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of insects filled the darkness around the family's hunting lodge. Alex later told investigators he had spent the evening visiting his father, who was in the hospital. When he returned home around 10 that evening, He made a discovery that would forever alter the course of his life and his family's legacy. The frantic 911 call captured Alex's apparent panic and desperation. His voice cracked as he told the dispatcher he had found his wife and son shot to death near the dog kennels on the family property. Maggie, 52 years old and the mother of his children, was dead. Paul, just 22 and still awaiting trial for Mallory's death, was also gone. First responders arrived to find a scene of unimaginable violence. Both victims had been shot multiple times with different weapons. Maggie appeared to have been killed with a rifle, while Paul had been shot with a shotgun. The brutality of the murders shocked even experienced investigators. The timing seemed almost too coincidental to believe. Paul was scheduled to face trial for the boat crash that killed Mallory Beach. The civil lawsuit was progressing, threatening to expose years of alleged cover-ups and obstruction. Financial problems at the law firm were mounting, and now, suddenly, two of the key figures in these various controversies were dead. The investigation into the double murder immediately became a media sensation. Here was a story that had everything: wealth, power, privilege, family secrets, and now, shocking violence. National news outlets descended on the small community, turning the quiet Lowcountry into the center of a true crime phenomenon. Alex became the focus of intense scrutiny. As the surviving family member who had discovered the bodies, he was automatically a person of interest. His alibi, visiting his sick father at the hospital, would be thoroughly investigated. But alibis can be complicated things, especially for someone with the resources and connections that Alex Murdaugh possessed. The murders also raised uncomfortable questions about motive. Who would want to kill a mother and her son? Was this connected to Paul's upcoming trial? Was someone seeking their own form of justice for Mallory Beach's death? Or were there other, darker reasons behind the violence? Some speculated that Alex himself might be involved. The financial pressures, the legal troubles, the threat to the family's reputation, all could provide motive. Others suggested it might be connected to the boat crash, that someone had decided to take justice into their own hands. But there was another theory that would soon prove prophetic. What if the murders were connected to something even more sinister? What if they were part of a larger pattern of violence and deception that stretched back years? As investigators dug deeper into the Murdaugh family's history, they began to uncover a web of alleged financial crimes, cover-ups, and suspicious deaths that painted a picture far different from the respectable legal dynasty the family had portrayed for over a century. The double murder of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh wasn't just a shocking crime. It was the event that would finally bring down one of South Carolina's most powerful families. The investigation would reveal secrets that had been buried for years, expose corruption that had infected the very institutions meant to protect justice, and ultimately lead to consequences that no amount of money or influence could prevent. The Murdaugh dynasty, built over generations and seemingly unshakable, was about to face its final reckoning. And at the center of it all was Alex Murdaugh, the man who had once wielded the power of his family name like a shield, now finding himself defenseless against the storm he had helped create. Summer of 2021 started like any other in Windsor, Wisconsin, a quiet suburb just outside Madison where families barbecued in their backyards and kids played in tree-lined streets. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, a web of lies was about to unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. What began as a routine missing persons report would expose deception so elaborate, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe what they were uncovering. And at the center of it all was a single piece of digital evidence that would change everything. A screenshot from Snapchat that would reveal the darkest family secret this small town had ever seen. This is the story of how social media became the key to solving one of Wisconsin's most disturbing crimes. How a loving couple's disappearance turned into a nightmare that no parent could ever imagine. And how their own son's digital footprint would ultimately lead investigators straight to the truth. My name is speaking to you from the heart of true crime. And what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Because sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones capable of the unthinkable. The Halderson family seemed to have it all figured out. Bart and Krista had built a beautiful life together in their Windsor home, complete with everything a middle-class American family could want. 2 sons they adored, stable careers, and a cherished family cabin up north where they could escape the pressures of everyday life. Bart worked as a managing director for an international accounting firm, the kind of guy who wore pressed shirts and kept detailed schedules. Krista balanced him perfectly as the nurturing heart of the family, working in customer service at an auto body shop while pursuing her love of art projects in her spare time. Together, they were the picture of suburban success. Their oldest son, Mitchell, had landed a job in tech and was building his own future. But it was their youngest, 23-year-old Chandler, who seemed to be on the most promising path of all. Still living at home while finishing college, he talked constantly about his internship at an insurance company and couldn't contain his excitement about landing what he claimed was his dream job at SpaceX. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, as it would turn out. Friday morning, July 2nd, 2021. Dan Croninger arrived at Zimbrick Body Shop expecting to see his friend and co-worker Krista at her usual spot. But her desk was empty, her computer was off, and there was no note, no message, no explanation for her absence. For anyone else, this might not have raised immediate alarm bells. People call in sick, emergencies happen. But Dan knew Krista better than most. In all the time they'd worked together, she had never simply failed to show up without calling. It wasn't in her nature to leave people hanging, especially not the customers who depended on her. When his calls went straight to voicemail and his text messages remained unanswered, Dan's concern began to grow. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut that afternoon, unable to shake his worry. Dan made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He drove to the Halderson home with his girlfriend, determined to check on his friend. The neighborhood was quiet, exactly as you'd expect on a summer afternoon in Windsor. Manicured lawns, white picket fences, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. When they knocked on the front door, silence greeted them. Dan peered through the window and noticed something odd. A coffee table had been knocked over near the fireplace, lying on its side like furniture displaced during some kind of struggle. But maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just bumped into it. Walking around to the garage, Dan's confusion deepened. Both of Bart and Krista's cars were sitting in their usual spots. If they had gone somewhere, how did they get there? He was beginning to circle around to the back of the house when the side door opened. Chandler emerged, wrapped in a towel, his hair wet from what he claimed was a recent shower. There was something in his demeanor that struck Dan as off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was just the shock of the situation. When Dan asked about his parents, Chandler had an immediate explanation. There had been an emergency at the family cabin up north, he said. His mom and dad had to leave suddenly that morning to deal with whatever crisis had emerged. It made sense, Dan supposed. These things happened with vacation properties. But as the days passed, Dan's relief began to transform back into concern. Chandler explained that cell service was spotty at the cabin, that his parents would only be able to communicate when atmospheric conditions were just right. It was a reasonable explanation for a remote location in northern Wisconsin. Sunday, July 4th. Chandler called Dan, complaining of boredom and asking if there was anything to do. Dan invited him over to watch fireworks, and during their conversation, asked about Bart and Krista. Chandler mentioned that he'd spoken with them, and they planned to return Monday. The detail was reassuring, even if something about the whole situation still felt slightly off. Monday came and went, with no sign of Krista at work. Tuesday brought more of the same. By Wednesday, July 7th, Dan's concern had transformed into genuine alarm. Krista had missed an important doctor's appointment that she'd been looking forward to, one that had already been rescheduled once. This wasn't like her at all. That morning, Dan pushed Chandler to do what needed to be done: file a missing persons report, get the authorities involved, find out what had happened to two people who had seemingly vanished without a trace. When Chandler Halderson walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office that Wednesday morning, he appeared to be nothing more than a concerned son desperate for answers about his missing parents. He told investigators that Bart and Krista had left Thursday morning with another couple to spend the long weekend at the family cabin in Langlade County, about 3 hours north of Windsor. Detectives Sabrina Sims and Brian Shunk were assigned to lead the investigation. As they began gathering information, several details immediately stood out as unusual. Neither Bart nor Krista had mentioned to co-workers or friends that they were planning a trip. Their older son, Mitchell, had no knowledge of any weekend plans. And perhaps most puzzling of all, no one seemed to know who this mysterious other couple was supposed to be. The family cabin held special significance for the Haldersons. Built by Krista's grandparents in the 1940s, it was a rustic retreat on a remote lake where the family had created decades of memories. It was exactly the kind of place where cell phone service might be unreliable, where people could disappear from the digital world for days at a time. But as investigators began reaching out to friends and family members, they discovered something troubling. Despite Chandler's claims that his parents had been planning this trip, no one else had heard anything about it. Not their co-workers, not their extended family, not even Mitchell. The day after the missing persons report was filed, Mitchell and his fiancée made the 3-hour drive north to the family cabin. They met with deputies from the Langlade County Sheriff's Office, hoping against hope that they would find some sign of Bart and Krista, some indication that they had been there, even if they had since moved on to another location. What they found instead was an empty cabin that clearly hadn't been occupied in weeks. The canoe sat unused in its storage shed. Dust had settled on surfaces that should have shown signs of recent activity. It was obvious that no one had been to the property in a very long time. While Mitchell was searching the cabin, Chandler was back in Windsor, going door to door through the neighborhood. Security cameras captured him moving from house to house, asking neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a devoted son desperately trying to find his missing parents. But investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in Chandler's story. Small details that didn't quite add up. Questions that seemed to have different answers depending on when they were asked. And then they received a tip that would change the entire direction of their investigation. A local farm owner contacted the sheriff's office with information about Chandler Halderson. She was a friend of his girlfriend, Kat, and she told detectives that she had seen Chandler at her property over the 4th of July weekend. But more importantly, she had seen him return alone the following day, July 5th, when his car was parked backed up to a field near her woodline. This was the first time anyone had mentioned Chandler being anywhere other than home during the time his parents were supposedly missing. and when detectives asked him about it directly, he had never mentioned visiting this farm at all. The discovery would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything Chandler Halderson had been trying to hide. Because sometimes, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. The farm where deputies were now searching belonged to someone connected to Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine Melander, who went by Cat. As investigators combed through the rural property, looking for any sign of what Chandler might have been doing there alone, they made a discovery that would forever change the trajectory of this case. Hidden among the tall grass and scattered debris, deputies found human remains. Not a complete body, but a male torso that had been carefully concealed with sticks and twigs. The grass around the area had been matted down, creating a clear trail that led directly to the grisly discovery. Detective Sims would later describe it as unlike anything she had encountered in her career. Most death investigations involve intact victims, crime scenes that tell a coherent story. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to a level of violence and calculated disposal that chilled even experienced investigators to their core. The discovery of the remains triggered an immediate shift in the investigation. What had begun as a missing persons case was now clearly a homicide, and the timing couldn't be ignored. Here was evidence of violence found at a location where Chandler Halderson had been seen alone, just days after his parents had supposedly left for their cabin trip. When detectives brought Chandler back to the station for questioning, the tone of their conversation was markedly different. They couldn't reveal exactly what they had found, but they made it clear that his story was falling apart. They knew he wasn't telling them the truth, and they needed him to explain what had really happened. But Chandler wasn't ready to break. Instead, he did what many suspects do when confronted with evidence they can't explain. He asked for a lawyer. The interview was over before investigators could get the answers they desperately needed. Within days, DNA testing confirmed what detectives already suspected. The remains found on the farm belonged to Bart Halderson. The preliminary autopsy results revealed that he had been shot at least twice in the back. This wasn't an accident or a moment of passion. Someone had executed Bart Halderson with cold precision. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Windsor community. A loving father and husband had been murdered and dismembered, his body parts scattered and hidden like refuse. And the person who had reported him missing, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for help finding him, was now the prime suspect. Chandler was arrested and charged with providing false information to law enforcement. It was a holding charge while investigators built their murder case, but there was still one terrifying question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Where was Krista Halderson? The discovery of Bart's remains had answered one question while creating an even more urgent one. If Chandler had killed his father, what had happened to his mother? Was she still alive somewhere? Possibly being held against her will, or had she met the same fate as her husband? Time was critical. If Krista was still alive, every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding her. But if she was dead, investigators needed to locate her remains before evidence deteriorated further. The summer heat and natural decomposition were working against them. This is where Catherine Melander's cooperation became absolutely crucial to the investigation. Kat had been dating Chandler for some time, and their relationship had been marked by infidelity and deception on his part. She had caught him cheating before, had confronted him about his lies, and had grown suspicious of his behavior. In response to her distrust, Kat had convinced Chandler to share his location with her through Snapchat. The popular social media app allows users to see where their friends are in real time, creating a digital trail of movement and activity. For Kat, it was a way to keep tabs on a boyfriend she no longer fully trusted. For investigators, it would prove to be the key to everything. When detectives asked for permission to download information from Kat's phone, she agreed without hesitation. She wanted to help find Bart and Krista, and she was beginning to suspect that her boyfriend might know more than he was telling anyone. What they found in Kat's phone records was a treasure trove of digital evidence. Not just location data, but timestamps, messages, and most importantly, a screenshot that Kat had saved during the crucial time period when the murders were believed to have occurred. The screenshot showed Chandler's Snapchat avatar positioned near the Wisconsin River, approximately 25 miles from his family home. The timestamp indicated it was taken on the morning of July 1st, and Kat had saved the image because she found his location suspicious. Why would her boyfriend be out in such a remote area so early in the morning? For investigators, this single piece of digital evidence was like finding a smoking gun. Here was proof that Chandler had been at a specific location during the time frame when his parents were supposedly leaving for their cabin trip. A location that was nowhere near his home. Nowhere near any legitimate reason for him to be there. The area near the Wisconsin River where Chandler's phone had pinged was dense with woodland and difficult terrain. It was exactly the kind of place someone might go if they needed to dispose of evidence without being seen. The kind of place where human remains could be hidden and might never be found without a specific reason to search there. Law enforcement teams from throughout Dane County converged on the area. Using the Snapchat data as their starting point, they began a methodical search of the wooded region along the riverbank. The vegetation was thick, the summer growth making visibility limited and progress slow. Chandler had been to this area before. A photograph from the previous year showed him at the same location, holding a large knife and smiling for the camera. It was the kind of outdoorsy photo that many young men post on social media. But in the context of the current investigation, it took on a much darker significance. The search teams worked for hours, covering ground methodically and carefully documenting anything they found. The area was remote enough that evidence could have remained undisturbed for weeks, but the July heat and humidity were working against preservation. When they finally made the discovery they had been dreading, it confirmed their worst fears, hidden in the dense underbrush. Searchers found human remains that had been dismembered and scattered, 2 legs cut into different sections, concealed among the vegetation like discarded waste. DNA testing would confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to Krista Halderson, the loving mother and wife who had failed to show up for work that Friday morning, had met the same brutal fate as her husband, the young man who had reported his parents missing, who had appeared on local news pleading for help in finding them, who had gone door to door asking neighbors for any information about their whereabouts, had been the one responsible for their deaths all along. But the question that would drive the prosecution's case was still unanswered. Why? What could possibly motivate a son to murder both of his parents in such a calculated and brutal manner? The answer, investigators would discover, lay in a web of lies so complex and elaborate that it had taken months to construct. Chandler Halderson had been living a completely fabricated life, telling everyone around him stories about academic success, professional opportunities, and future prospects that existed only in his imagination. And when that carefully constructed fantasy began to crumble, when the truth threatened to expose him, he had chosen the most unthinkable solution possible. The digital evidence that would ultimately convict him came from the very technology he had grown up with. Social media apps designed to connect people and share experiences had instead created an unbreakable chain of evidence that led directly to the sound of a door slamming shut, a child's scream piercing through the darkness. Blood splattered across kitchen floors. For 11-year-old Angelina Fernandez, the night of May 8th, 2014 would become burned into her memory forever. What she witnessed from her bedroom window that night would tear apart everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the man she called her stepfather. This is the story of a relationship that began with promise and ended in tragedy. A story where the line between victim and perpetrator becomes dangerously blurred, where a mother's desperate fight for survival would cost one man his life and leave a young girl questioning everything she believed about the adults who were supposed to protect her. Some stories have clear heroes and villains. This isn't one of them. Tonight, we take you inside one of the most complex cases of domestic violence and self-defense that investigators have ever encountered. Through the eyes of Angelina, now 20 years old, we'll uncover the hidden world of abuse, control, and fear that existed behind closed doors in Worcester, Massachusetts. What really happened that night, when Andrew Wagner bled to death on a kitchen floor, was Stephanie Fernandez a victim fighting for her life, or a woman who crossed the line from self-defense into murder? And what did young Angelina actually see from her bedroom window that would haunt her for years to come? The answers aren't simple. They never are when love turns deadly. Let's begin with the before. Before the blood. Before the screaming. Before everything changed forever. Stephanie Fernandez was living the single mother life, working nights to provide for her 6-year-old daughter Angelina. Beautiful, with striking eyes and flowing hair, Stephanie had found work at a Massachusetts nightclub as an exotic dancer. It wasn't the career path she'd dreamed of, but it paid the bills and allowed her to be home during the day with her little girl. Angelina remembers those early years fondly. Her mother was energetic, loving, always tucking her in at night with kisses and bedtime stories. They were a team, just the two of them against the world. But in 2009, everything would change when a new customer walked into the club where Stephanie worked. Andrew Wagner was impossible to miss. Tall, muscular, with piercing blue eyes and a charming smile. He worked at a Costco tire shop during the day and dreamed of a career in law enforcement. When he spotted Stephanie on stage that night, he was instantly captivated. What started as conversation between performer and customer quickly became something more intense. They talked for hours that first night, an instant chemistry neither could deny. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within months, they were living together. For 6-year-old Angelina, Andrew represented something she'd never had before, a father figure. He was fun and playful, taking them on vacations to Cape Cod every summer, watching Criminal Minds together on quiet evenings, creating the kind of family memories that every child deserves. Stephanie was smitten too. Here was a man who seemed to adore her, who wanted to build a life together, who promised the picture-perfect American dream she'd always craved. A nice house, marriage, maybe more children. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But even in those early honeymoon days, there were warning signs that neither Angelina nor the outside world could see. Signs that would only become clear years later when investigators began piecing together the true nature of Andrew and Stephanie's relationship. The possessiveness started almost immediately. Andrew couldn't stand the thought of other men looking at Stephanie. He demanded she quit dancing at the club, cutting off her primary source of income. When she jokingly asked who would pay her bills, his response made it clear this wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. The jealousy was overwhelming. He monitored her every move, questioned her about every conversation, every friendship, every moment they weren't together. What Stephanie initially interpreted as love and devotion was actually the beginning of a pattern of control that would define their entire relationship. But love can make us blind to red flags. Stephanie saw Andrew's intensity as proof of how much he cared. She moved in with him, rearranged her entire life around his demands, and slowly began isolating herself from friends and family who might have seen what she couldn't. For young Angelina, the changes were subtle at first. Andrew was still the fun stepfather figure who took them on vacations and made her mother smile. But even at her age, she began noticing things. Raised voices behind closed doors, her mother's mood swings, tensions that seemed to appear out of nowhere. As 2010 turned into 2011 and 2011 became 2012, the facade of the perfect family began to crack. What neighbors and friends saw was a couple planning their future together. Andrew had even become a corrections officer, finally achieving his dream of working in law enforcement. They bought a condo together, got engaged, started planning a wedding. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. One of escalating violence, psychological manipulation, and a young girl who was beginning to understand that the adults in her life were keeping dangerous secrets. Stephanie's friend Danielle from the club began noticing changes in the woman she once knew. Bruises that appeared mysteriously and were quickly covered with makeup. Grab marks on her arms that looked like fingerprints. Injuries that seemed too specific, too intentional to be accidents. The cycle was beginning. The pattern that domestic violence experts know all too well. Tension building, explosion of violence, honeymoon period of apologies and promises to change, then right back to building tension again. Each cycle getting worse. Each explosion more dangerous than the last. Andrew's gun, which he carried as part of his job as a corrections officer, became a tool of intimidation. Stephanie would later describe incidents where he would make sure she knew it was loaded, where he would threaten her with it during their worst fights. The weapon that was supposed to protect people had become an instrument of fear in their home. And through it all, 11-year-old Angelina was absorbing everything. Children see more than adults realize. They hear arguments through walls. They notice when mom has been crying. They feel the tension that fills a house even when no one is speaking. Angelina began having conversations with her mother about what she was witnessing. Even at her young age, she knew something was terribly wrong between the two people who were supposed to be creating a safe home for her. The breaking point was coming. The night that would change everything was approaching fast. But first, there would be one more attempt at escape. One more try at breaking free from the cycle of violence that had consumed their lives. Stephanie would briefly leave Andrew for another man, someone who treated her with kindness and respect. Someone who proposed marriage and offered her a chance at the life she'd always wanted. It seemed like salvation, but in relationships like theirs, escape is never simple. Andrew Wagner wasn't going to let the woman he considered his property walk away, and the consequences of that possessiveness would soon turn deadly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end with blood on the kitchen floor, a child screaming from an upstairs window, and a man dying while paramedics fought desperately to save his life. What Angelina saw that night would haunt her forever. And the questions surrounding what really happened between her mother and stepfather would divide a courtroom, a community, and even her own family for years to come. But the escape attempt wasn't what it seemed. In 2013, Stephanie did leave Andrew for another man, Mike Laramie, someone from her past who promised her the stability and love she'd been desperately seeking. The contrast was stark. Where Andrew was controlling and violent, Mike was gentle and caring. He carried her to bed when she fell asleep on the couch. He treated her like the queen she'd always wanted to be. When Mike proposed during a romantic getaway to Niagara Falls, Stephanie said yes without hesitation. She accepted a $44,000 engagement ring and began planning a future free from the nightmare her life had become. For a brief moment, it seemed like she and Angelina might finally have the peaceful life they deserved. But Andrew Wagner wasn't going to let her go that easily. The threats started immediately. Text messages filled with rage and promises of violence. Andrew made it clear that if Stephanie didn't return to him, both she and Mike would pay the ultimate price. He knew where they lived. He knew their routines. He had access to weapons through his job as a corrections officer. The fear was overwhelming. Stephanie found herself caught between two impossible choices: stay with Mike and risk getting him killed, or return to Andrew and accept that she might not survive much longer. The decision was made for her when Andrew's threats became too specific, too detailed, too real to ignore. She ended the engagement with Mike and went back to Andrew, not out of love, but out of terror. She knew that refusing him would mean death for herself and possibly others. So she returned to the cycle of abuse, hoping somehow she could find another way out before it was too late. But going back to Andrew after leaving him for another man had consequences. The violence escalated to levels even worse than before. The jealousy became more intense, the control more suffocating. He monitored her every movement, questioned every conversation, and made it clear that any future attempts to leave would result in tragedy. Angelina watched all of this unfold with the helpless horror that only a child can feel. She was old enough to understand that her mother was in danger, but too young to know how to help. The arguments became louder. The tension in the house became unbearable. She could see the fear in her mother's eyes, even when Stephanie tried to hide it. As 2014 began, the pressure in their household was reaching a breaking point. Andrew's text messages to Stephanie became increasingly threatening. Just 3 days before his death, he sent her a message that would later be read in court: "I'm going to kill you." It wasn't the first time he'd made such a threat, and Stephanie had no reason to believe it would be the last. The morning of May 7, 2014 started like any other day, but the tension was palpable. Andrew and Stephanie got into an argument early in the morning, and according to Stephanie's later testimony, he struck her several times before leaving for work. It was a preview of what was to come that evening. That night, 11-year-old Angelina went to bed early, exhausted from the constant stress that had become the norm in their household. She had no way of knowing that the next few hours would change her life forever, or that she would become the sole witness to one of the most controversial cases of domestic violence and self-defense in Massachusetts history. Downstairs, Stephanie was preparing dinner in the kitchen when Andrew returned home from his shift as a corrections officer. What started as questions about what she'd been doing while he was away quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. According to Stephanie's testimony, Andrew became enraged when she refused his sexual advances. The argument intensified rapidly, with Andrew becoming increasingly violent. He struck her in the head, tried to pin her down, and attempted to remove her clothing against her will. Then he pulled out his service weapon. The gun that Andrew carried as part of his job had been used to intimidate Stephanie before. But this time felt different. This time, she believed he was actually going to kill her. In a moment of desperation, she broke free and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and analyzed by domestic violence experts for years to come. The exact sequence of events, the positioning of both people, the intent behind each action, all of it would become crucial pieces of evidence in determining whether Stephanie Fernandez was a victim defending herself or a woman who had crossed the line into murder. According to Stephanie, she held the knife defensively, screaming for Andrew to stay away from her. But Andrew didn't stop. Instead, he charged toward her, just as he had done so many times before when he wanted to intimidate her with his size and strength. In that split second, with Andrew coming at her and nowhere left to run, Stephanie's survival instincts took over. The knife in her hand connected with Andrew's neck, severing his carotid artery in a wound that would prove fatal within minutes. The kitchen floor was quickly covered in blood. Andrew collapsed, his life draining away rapidly from the devastating injury. Stephanie, covered in blood and in complete shock, couldn't find her cell phone in the chaos. She ran outside, screaming for help from anyone who could hear her, upstairs. Angelina was awakened by the sound of a door slamming shut. But it was what she heard next that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her mother's voice, filled with terror, screaming into the night. "Help me, someone, help me!" Angelina rushed to her bedroom window and looked down at the scene below. What she saw was something no child should ever witness. Her mother was covered in blood, hysterical with panic. Andrew was lying motionless on the ground while neighbors and paramedics worked frantically to save his life. The 11-year-old girl who had spent years watching the adults in her life hurt each other was now witnessing the ultimate consequence of that violence. One of them was dying, and the other might be going to prison forever. Police officers quickly arrived on the scene, taking control of what had become a chaotic nightmare. Angelina was removed from the house and taken to stay with relatives, while her mother was placed in handcuffs and driven to the police station for questioning. Andrew Wagner was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. The knife had cut through his carotid artery, and despite the best efforts of medical professionals, he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. In the span of just a few minutes, everything had changed. A man was dead, a woman was facing murder charges, and a young girl had lost both of the parental figures in her life, one to death, and one to the criminal justice system. The investigation that followed would uncover a complex web of abuse, control, and violence that had been hidden behind closed doors for years. Text messages, photographs, witness testimonies, and medical records would all be scrutinized as prosecutors and defense attorneys tried to determine what really happened that night. But for Angelina, the legal proceedings that would follow were secondary to the immediate trauma of what she had experienced. The child who had spent years trying to protect her mother from an abusive relationship was now facing the possibility that her mother might never come home again. The questions that would dominate the courtroom: was it murder or self-defense? Was Stephanie a victim or a perpetrator? Was the killing justified or criminal? Were complex legal and moral issues that would divide experts and jury members alike. But for the little girl looking down from her bedroom window that night, there was only one question that mattered: what was going to happen to her now? The courtroom proceedings that followed would become a battleground of competing narratives. 2 years after that horrific night, Stephanie Fernandez found herself sitting at the defendant's table, facing first-degree murder charges that could send her to prison for life. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman with a history of violence, someone who had manipulated and controlled the men in her life just as much as they had controlled her. They brought forward witnesses who testified about Stephanie's explosive temper, her tendency toward physical confrontation, her pattern of escalating conflicts. Michael Laramie, her former fiancé, took the stand to describe incidents where Stephanie had allegedly threatened him with knives, damaged his furniture in fits of rage, and created an atmosphere of fear in his own home. His testimony suggested that Stephanie was not the helpless victim her defense team claimed, but rather someone capable of initiating violence herself. But the defense told a very different story. They brought in domestic violence experts who explained the complex psychology of abuse victims, how years of trauma can alter someone's perception of danger, how the cycle of violence creates a prison that's almost impossible to escape. The most compelling evidence in Stephanie's favor came from an unexpected source: the police detective who had interviewed her the night Andrew died. Detective William Perrow testified about the fresh bruises he had observed on Stephanie's body, injuries consistent with a recent physical altercation. The video of that interview showed a woman in genuine shock and distress, not someone who had coldly calculated a murder. The medical examiner's testimony added another layer of complexity. The angle and depth of Andrew's wound suggested it could have occurred during a struggle, possibly when he grabbed Stephanie's hand while she was holding the knife defensively. The forensic evidence couldn't definitively prove whether the stabbing was intentional or accidental for Angelina, now a teenager. Watching her mother's trial was like reliving that nightmare night over and over again. She testified on her mother's behalf, describing years of witnessing Andrew's violent behavior, the fear that permeated their household, the way her mother had tried to protect both of them from escalating abuse. The jury deliberated for 9 long hours, weighing evidence that pointed in multiple directions. Were they looking at a cold-blooded killer who had finally snapped, or a desperate woman who had acted in a moment of genuine fear for her life? Their verdict reflected the complexity of the case. Stephanie was found guilty not of first-degree murder, but of voluntary manslaughter, a conviction that acknowledged she had killed Andrew Wagner, but not with premeditation or malice aforethought. Judge James Reardon sentenced Stephanie to 8 to 10 years in state prison, a sentence that satisfied neither side completely. Andrew's family felt justice had not been fully served, while Stephanie's supporters believed she had been punished for defending herself against an abuser. But perhaps the most important voice in all of this belonged to Angelina herself. Now studying forensic psychology, she has dedicated her life to understanding the complex dynamics of abuse and helping other children who find themselves caught in similar situations. Speaking about her mother's case years later, Angelina remains unwavering in her belief that Stephanie was a victim who had exhausted all other options. She had witnessed firsthand the escalating violence, the threats, the atmosphere of terror that had consumed their household. Today, Angelina looks forward to her mother's eventual release from prison, hoping they can rebuild their relationship and heal from the trauma that has defined so much of their lives. She carries with her the memories of that little girl who looked down from her bedroom window and saw her world fall apart, but also the strength of a young woman determined to break the cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed her family. The case of Stephanie Fernandez raises uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, self-defense, and the complex gray areas where victim and perpetrator intersect. It reminds us that real life rarely provides the clear-cut answers we desperately seek, and that sometimes the most tragic stories are those where everyone involved has been both victim and perpetrator in their own way. What Angelina saw that night changed her forever, but it also gave her a mission to ensure that other children don't have to witness the same horrors, and that victims of domestic violence have better options than the impossible choice her mother faced on May 7th, 2014. The blood has long since been cleaned from that kitchen floor, but the questions raised by this case continue to challenge our understanding of justice, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves and those they love. Tonight, we're diving into a story that changed everything for one family, one university community, and everyone who knew her. This isn't just another campus tragedy. This is about secrets hidden behind late-night texts, about warning signs that went unnoticed, and about a young woman who never saw what was coming. Alexandria Costial, known to everyone as Allie, was living what seemed like the perfect college dream at the University of Mississippi. She was bright, bubbly, and full of life. She had that infectious smile that could light up any room she walked into. But underneath the surface of her seemingly perfect college experience, something much darker was brewing. What you're about to hear will shock you. Because while Allie was planning her future, someone else was planning something entirely different. And the digital trail they left behind tells a story so disturbing, so calculated, that it's hard to believe it really happened. This is the complete story of what Allie Costial didn't know. And by the end, you'll understand why this case sent shockwaves through Oxford, Mississippi, and beyond. Let me take you back to July 20th, 2019. It was supposed to be just another summer day. The kind of day where college students sleep in, maybe catch up on some studying, or hang out with friends. But for Allie Costial, this day would be her last. Deputies from the Lafayette County Sheriff's Department were conducting routine patrols around Sardis Lake, about 30 miles from the Ole Miss campus. This wasn't an area where you'd expect to find college students. It's remote, isolated, surrounded by hunting camps and recreational spots that most people don't even know exist. When you're out there at night, you're completely alone. No streetlights, no other people, just darkness. That's where they found her. A white female lying on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds to her back. Not just one or two shots, multiple. The kind of shooting that speaks to something personal, something filled with rage. As the ambulance crew was driving to the scene, they noticed something in the road ditch, a purse. When they opened it, they found what they needed to identify the victim, an Ole Miss student ID card and a driver's license. The name read Alexandria Costial. Nobody could have predicted that this bubbly marketing student would end up in such a horrific situation. Allie was the kind of person who got along with everyone. She was spirited, always smiling, always looking for the next adventure. She had come to Ole Miss with big dreams. She wanted the full college experience at a major university, complete with good academics and great football, and she found exactly what she was looking for. Allie absolutely loved Ole Miss. She embraced everything about the school, from the traditions to the social scene. She was living her best college life, or so it seemed. But here's what makes this case so chilling. While Allie was building friendships, going to classes, and enjoying college, someone was watching, someone was planning, someone was researching, and that someone was closer to her than anyone realized. When investigators arrived at Allie's apartment, they made a discovery that would crack this case wide open. They found her Apple Watch. Now, Allie's phone was nowhere to be found. But here's the thing about technology today. Even when someone tries to cover their tracks, digital footprints remain. Those text messages were still syncing to that watch, creating a timeline that investigators could follow. What they discovered in those messages was disturbing, really disturbing. We're talking about conversations that revealed a side of Allie's life that even her closest friends didn't know about. Long, emotional exchanges with someone who seemed to be playing games with her emotions. Someone who was manipulating her, leading her on, and keeping her hanging by a thread. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that was anything but healthy. Allie was pouring her heart out in lengthy texts, sometimes sent in the middle of the night. The responses she got back were cold, distant, sometimes cruel. It was the kind of digital relationship that would make anyone who cared about Allie deeply concerned. But here's what's truly haunting about this case. Allie's friends and family had no idea about the extent of this relationship. She was keeping it secret, hidden from the people who loved her most. The people who might have been able to help her see what was really happening. Her best friend from high school, someone who knew Allie better than almost anyone, never even met this person. Think about that for a second. Your best friend is having this intense, complicated relationship with someone, and you've never even been introduced to them. That's not normal. That's a red flag. But Allie was caught up in something that she thought was romantic. She thought she had found someone special, someone who understood her. She had no way of knowing that this person was capable of something so unthinkable. The investigation moved quickly once they had those text messages. They could see exactly who Allie had been communicating with in her final hours. The last person she had been texting with was a fellow student named Brandon Thiesfeld. He was from Texas, and he and Allie had known each other since their freshman year. When investigators tried to contact Brandon for questioning, he kept making excuses. He couldn't meet on Saturday. He couldn't meet on Sunday. Finally, he agreed to come in Monday morning at 8:30. But when Monday morning came, Brandon was nowhere to be found. That's when investigators knew they had their suspect. They started tracking his phone in real time, and what they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Brandon was on Interstate 55 headed north toward Memphis. He wasn't coming in to answer questions. He was running. Law enforcement immediately issued a BOLO. Be on the lookout for Brandon and his vehicle. It didn't take long to find him. The Memphis Fugitive Task Force spotted him at a gas station, sitting in his pickup truck with very distinctive license plates that were hard to miss. When they arrested Brandon, they found something that made this case even more shocking. He had a .40 caliber gun with him, the same caliber as the shell casings found at the crime scene. And he had blood on his clothing. But the most disturbing part was yet to come. When investigators searched Brandon's apartment, they found a letter that prosecutors say was essentially a confession. In it, Brandon wrote about having terrible thoughts. He wrote that this was the end for him, that he was either going to prison or going to die. He wrote that he knew he was going to get caught. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't something that happened in the heat of the moment. This was planned, calculated, methodical. As investigators dug deeper into Brandon's digital footprint, what they uncovered was absolutely terrifying. This wasn't just about the letter they found in his apartment. This was about a web search history that revealed the mind of someone planning something horrific. In the days leading up to Allie's murder, Brandon had been conducting internet searches that would make your skin crawl. He was looking up how to get away with crimes, how to conceal evidence, how to tie people up, how to lure victims. He even searched for information about Ted Bundy, the notorious serial killer. Think about that for a moment. While Allie was going about her daily life, attending classes, hanging out with friends, maybe texting him about their complicated relationship, he was researching methods of murder. He was studying the techniques of one of America's most infamous killers. Brandon's defense attorney would later try to explain away these searches, claiming they were just the result of watching crime shows or documentaries. But prosecutors saw something much more sinister. They saw preparation. They saw planning. They saw a man who was methodically preparing to commit murder. The timeline that investigators pieced together was chilling. About a week before Allie's death, Brandon had taken a road trip back home to Fort Worth, Texas. On that same day, Allie had sent him photos of what appeared to be home pregnancy tests. The results were ambiguous, unclear, but the implication was obvious. Less than 48 hours later, Brandon posted something on social media that should have sent up every red flag imaginable. He posted a photo of a .40 caliber gun with a caption that read, "Finally taking my baby back to Oxford." The weapon he was referring to would later be identified as the murder weapon. When you look at all of this evidence together, the picture becomes crystal clear. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This wasn't something that happened in the heat of the moment. This was premeditated murder, planned out over days, maybe even weeks. But what about Allie? What was going on in her mind during this time? The text messages recovered from her Apple Watch revealed something heartbreaking. She was desperately trying to maintain a relationship with someone who was already planning to kill her. The messages show Allie reaching out repeatedly, sometimes sending long, emotional texts in the middle of the night. She was vulnerable. She was confused, and she was hoping for some kind of resolution to their complicated situation. She had no idea that the person she was pouring her heart out to was researching how to murder her. In one particularly disturbing exchange, Ally had sent Brandon photos of what she believed might be positive pregnancy tests. She was anxious, conflicted, and looking for support. His response was cold and calculating. He told her that if she was pregnant, they weren't keeping it. He suggested she get what he called the pill, meaning an abortion pill. But here's what makes this even more tragic. The autopsy later revealed that Allie was not pregnant at the time of her death. Whatever she thought might be happening, whatever was causing her anxiety about a possible pregnancy, it wasn't real. She may have had a miscarriage earlier, or the tests may have been false positives. Either way, she died believing something that wasn't even true. The forensic psychologist who analyzed their text messages described it as a completely one-sided relationship. Allie was investing everything emotionally, while Brandon was barely participating. He would respond just enough to keep her interested, just enough to maintain control. But he showed no genuine care or concern for her well-being. Some of Allie's messages were deeply troubling. She would text about drinking heavily, consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol. Whether this was true or exaggerated to get Brandon's attention, it showed how desperate she was becoming. She was crying out for help, for someone to care about her, and the person she was reaching out to was planning her murder. The night of July 19th, the day before her death, Ally and Brandon exchanged a series of texts that would be among their last. He asked if she would be home, if her house was private, if her friends would be around. To Ally, these might have seemed like questions from someone who wanted to talk privately about their relationship. To Brandon, these were questions about whether there would be witnesses. Around 1:30 in the morning on July 20th, security cameras captured Allie walking out of a bar in Oxford Square. She was alone, probably thinking she was going to meet someone who cared about her. Instead, she was walking toward her death. Brandon picked her up and drove her to Sardis Lake, that remote, isolated area where no one would hear what was about to happen. It's about a 10-minute drive on a dirt road once you leave the main highway. Once you're back there, you're completely cut off from civilization. Investigators found evidence at the scene that painted a picture of what happened next. There were cans of White Claw hard seltzer on a picnic table, suggesting they had been drinking together. There were 11 shell casings scattered around the area, indicating that Brandon had moved around while shooting. The ballistics evidence showed that Brandon had fired one shot from across the table where they were sitting. Then he got up and started moving around her. Continuing to fire, he circled her, shooting her repeatedly as she tried to get away. This wasn't a single shot in a moment of anger. This was an execution. Allie was shot at least 9 times, mostly in the back and upper torso. The medical examiner determined that she would have died within minutes from the injuries. But the sheer number of shots fired suggests something beyond even premeditated murder. This was overkill. This was rage. This was someone making absolutely sure that his victim would not survive. After the shooting, Brandon simply left her there. He left her body in that remote location and drove away, probably thinking that it would be days or weeks before anyone found her. He might have gotten away with it if not for those routine patrols by the sheriff's deputies. When Brandon was arrested at that gas station in Memphis, he was calm. He didn't resist. He invoked his rights and refused to speak to investigators. But his attorney would later reveal what Brandon claimed happened that night. According to Brandon's version of events, they had both been drinking heavily. He claimed he had been using cocaine, that his judgment was impaired. He said the shooting came out of nowhere, that it wasn't planned. But the evidence told a very different story. The prosecution saw this as a clear case of premeditated murder with kidnapping. They believed Brandon had lured Allie to that remote location under false pretenses, with the specific intent to kill her. In Mississippi, that combination of crimes carries the possibility of the death penalty. For over 2 years, this case wound its way through the legal system. Brandon's family hired experienced attorneys who explored every possible defense. They considered arguing that this was a crime of passion, that Brandon's judgment was impaired by alcohol and drugs. They looked at his mental health history, his lack of any previous violent behavior. But ultimately, the evidence was too overwhelming. The web searches, the planning, the gun, the remote location, the text messages, it all pointed to the same conclusion. This was a calculated murder, planned and executed by someone who simply didn't want to deal with the complications that Allie represented in his life. On August 27, 2021, more than 2 years after Allie's death, Brandon Thiesfeld appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit, surrounded by Allie's family and friends, many wearing pink in her honor. He did something that surprised everyone. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, standing in that courtroom. Brandon Thiesfeld finally spoke. His voice was barely audible, muffled and shaking as he addressed the judge. He said there was no excuse for his actions. He said he had asked God for forgiveness, and that he hoped someday Allie's family might find it in their hearts to forgive him too. But his words felt hollow to everyone who had followed this case, because the evidence showed that this wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was a deliberate, calculated decision to end a young woman's life simply because she had become inconvenient. The judge sentenced Brandon Thiesfeld to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Mississippi, there is no parole for murder. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and he will never again have the opportunity to hurt another person the way he hurt Allie. But even with Brandon's confession and sentencing, questions remained. His defense attorney maintained that Brandon was impaired by alcohol and cocaine that night, that something just snapped inside him. Yet when pressed about why Brandon killed Allie, there was no good answer. There was no justification that made any sense. Brandon himself never provided a clear motive. He told his attorney that he didn't believe Allie was actually pregnant, that he doubted her claims. But if that's true, then why plan such an elaborate murder? Why research methods of killing? Why lure her to that remote location? The truth is probably simpler and more disturbing than any complex psychological explanation. Brandon Thiesfeld was a young man who wanted to live his life without complications. Allie represented a complication. She was emotional. She was needy. She was asking for things he didn't want to give. And rather than simply ending their relationship like a normal person would do, he decided to end her life. It's a level of selfishness and cruelty that's almost impossible to comprehend. Allie wasn't threatening him. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was just a young woman who thought she was in love with someone who might love her back. For that, she paid with her life. The impact of Allie's murder rippled far beyond that courtroom in Mississippi. Her family was devastated, of course. Her parents, Cindy and Keith Costiel, had to somehow find a way to continue living after losing their daughter in such a horrific way. They chose not to read the text messages that investigators recovered, saying they weren't sure they could handle seeing the details of Allie's final days. Her friends were left questioning everything they thought they knew. How had they missed the signs? How had Allie kept such a significant relationship secret from the people who cared about her most? They were haunted by the thought that maybe, if they had known what was happening, they could have saved her. The University of Mississippi community was shaken to its core. This was one of their own, a student who embodied everything positive about the college experience. She was involved, she was social, she was achieving her dreams. The fact that she could be murdered by a fellow student in such a brutal way challenged everyone's sense of safety and security. But perhaps the most important lesson from Allie's story is about the dangers of toxic relationships, especially in the age of digital communication. The text messages between Allie and Brandon revealed a pattern that experts recognize as emotionally abusive. He was manipulating her, keeping her off balance, giving her just enough attention to keep her hooked while never actually committing to a real relationship. Allie's friends noticed that she never talked about Brandon, even though they could see she was involved with someone. That secrecy was a red flag, a sign that something wasn't right about the relationship. But Allie was caught up in the drama, convinced that if she could just say the right thing or do the right thing, she could make it work. Young women need to understand that healthy relationships don't require secrecy. They don't involve endless late-night texts trying to convince someone to care about you. They don't involve walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing. And they certainly don't involve partners who research methods of murder while pretending to care about you. The digital age has created new ways for predators to manipulate and control their victims. Brandon was able to maintain psychological control over Allie through text messages, keeping her emotionally invested while planning her death. He used her phone to research her vulnerabilities, her schedule, her living situation. Technology that should have protected her instead became a tool for her murder. As we remember Allie Costiel, we should remember her for who she really was. She was a bright, enthusiastic young woman who loved sunsets and took pictures of them for her Instagram account. She was studying marketing and dreaming of her future. She wanted to meet someone special, get married, and have a family someday. She thought she had found that person in Brandon Thiesfeld. What Allie didn't know was that the person she trusted with her deepest feelings, her fears, and her hopes was incapable of genuine human connection. She didn't know that while she was pouring her heart out in those late-night text messages, he was already planning her death. She didn't know that her kindness and vulnerability would be seen as weaknesses to exploit rather than qualities to cherish. Most tragically, Allie didn't know that she deserved so much better. She deserved someone who would value her, respect her, and treat her with the love and care that every human being deserves. Instead, she encountered evil in the form of someone who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Today, Allie's family and friends honor her memory by sharing her story, hoping that other young women might recognize the warning signs that Allie missed. They want people to know that love shouldn't hurt, that relationships shouldn't be secret, and that no one should ever feel like they have to convince someone to care about them. Every sunset now reminds them of Allie, of her passion for beauty and her zest for life. In their grief, they try to carry forward her light, her enthusiasm, and her belief in the goodness of the world. It's what she would have wanted, and it's the only way to make sense of such a senseless tragedy. This is what Ali Kostiel didn't know, and this is why we must never forget her story.